Alright, hello everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about the Trompowsky opening, specifically from the black side today. And if you don't know what this opening is, it's the opening that occurs after d4, knight 6, bishop g5. And this is an opening that, for me personally, I struggled with a lot for a couple of years, and only over the last year or so, I felt like I really found a pretty good antidote against it, which is really reliable. And I'm going to share that with you guys today so that you too can have success against this opening. And now, this certainly isn't the most common move that you're going to face, back a move here. After knight f6, if we look at database statistics, you'll see that bishop g5 comes around in the 6th most popular move here, which pales in comparison to stuff like c4, the London, all that good stuff. But it is very dangerous, and if you look at the score here, it scores 49% win for white, which if you compare it to some of the other moves is a bit higher. So essentially, what is the idea of the Trompowsky then? Well, it basically is to put the bishop on this kind of active square here, where it also threatens to really just double our pawns very simply. And then white's going to try and claim some sort of structural advantage and play around that. And hence, some of the most popular moves of black involve avoiding those double pawns. For example, the most popular move in the Lee chess database is to play e6. But this comes with the drawback that allows white to gain some space in the center with e4. Of course, we can't take because that hangs our queen. So what black will usually do is they'll kick the bishop away, and now white basically has to give up the bishop here, because if they try to keep this pin here, we'll just play g5 and win a pawn like this. So what they'll usually do is they'll take on f6, and then we get this sort of position which is pretty interesting, where white has the center and black has the bishop here, but personally it's not quite to my taste. Black can also just kick away the bishop with knight e4, and there's some very interesting stuff, like white can play bishop f4, this is the most common approach, and very often black will counterattack in the center with c5, white will play f3, black will deliver this interesting queen check here, and we get this sort of position eventually where white's going to play e4, so we have this sort of weird Benoni type position where personally, I've never studied these too much, so I don't really know what's going on, but to me it's always seemed like white has a little bit of pressure in these sort of positions. Also, not to mention, back here, white can play this interesting move h4, which has the rather scary name, the Raptor variation, so that might be enough reason to avoid it on its own. But the variation I'm going to recommend avoids all of these tricky shenanigans, at least in my opinion, and I'm just aiming for a more kind of simple positional game with d5. And maybe this isn't what you're after, but for me this has always been a very simple way to approach it, and very often Trompowsky players, they like very kind of dynamic games where there's all sort of attacking possibilities, but against this, it's really difficult to kind of get those sort of positions. And white kind of has two different approaches here. One is they can play some sort of waiting move, or just developing move, I guess, like e3, knight d2, knight f3. But the sort of critical test of d5 is to take on f6 and double our pawns immediately, and this is what I'm going to focus on mostly in this video, but I'm going to also mention, I'm also going to briefly look over e3 a bit after bishop takes f6. So, after bishop takes f6, it's important to note that black has two recaptures here. They can take with the e pawn, or they can take with g pawn. And both are actually pretty playable, and I think at the top level right now, g takes f6 is kind of what's dominating. However, personally, I like e takes f6 a bit more, and the reason is it just makes our king feel a little bit safer, whereas g takes f6 is a little bit more risky, but also, I guess, the reward could arguably be a bit higher. And from here, white has kind of a couple different setups, but there's one that they mostly go for. And it's after e3, bishop d6, they could play more of a system-like setup where they just put their pawns on dark squares, since they trade off their dark with the bishop. This is kind of a very common strategy in various openings, and then they'll put the bishop on g2, knight e2, then knight d2, push c4 a bit later, and then try and just claim that they have some sort of structural advantage. Or immediately they can play c4, which is much more common, and this is what I'm mostly going to be looking at. And basically the idea is that after d takes c4, bishop takes c4, we're going to get this sort of position here where black has double pawns, white has some sort of structural advantage, but we shouldn't forget that black has the bishop pair, and the double pawns can actually come in quite handy here, because we're soon going to see that we can play this nice move f5. And f5 very nicely controls the center here by occupying the e4 square, preventing white from also pushing e4 themselves, and from here it also clears this way for our knight to come to f6, our queen might come to e7 next. And in general, the position I'll just say is quite pleasant. White might play like queen c2, just attacking the pawn for a bit. We'll play knight f6. And I think we should really take stock here and really just kind of understand what the various plans are for both sides. it's very difficult for white to really move in the center with like e4 and d5, because both of those moves are really going to help open the position, and when you don't have the bishop here but your opponent does, you should be careful in doing so, because it could end up in a not so desirable situation for yourself. So white kind of is limited to really this sort of queenside plan where they're very often going to play something like rook b1 and b4 and b5, which we'd call a minority attack. Very often these minority attacks aren't even that appealing in these sort of positions. One reason being that one, well, they're a bit slow, and another is that very often, because white doesn't even have their dark squared bishop on the board anymore, it's actually not that difficult for black to display something like queen e7, a5, and it becomes kind of difficult for white to actually even carry out b4 at times. Meanwhile, black kind of has a very free position. They can play stuff like queen e7, knight e4, even consider pushing their h-pawn up the board, which we're going to see in one of the games I played, and even playing stuff like b5 and a5, even though the queen side is usually where white's play is. So now that we looked at bishop takes f6, I want to briefly cover e3 as well. And the most common move here, or at least the one that's most common at the master level, is to play c5, just counter-attacking immediately in the center. Very logical and principled move. However, what you have to understand is it's not very coherent with our choice against bishop takes f6. And what I mean by that is if white played bishop takes f6 here, we're forced to make a choice. And in my opinion, g takes f6 is probably the best move here. Although e takes f6 is also pretty playable, but compared to the other line, we don't really want to play c5. We'd much rather have our pawn back here on c6. Because now, say white plays c3, knight c6, we get this sort of position where after bishop takes c5, knight f3, we're stuck with this isolated pawn, these doubled pawns, and white just has this very simple development scheme of like knight d2, knight b3, bishop e2, castles. And sure, black kind of has a bishop here, but it doesn't feel so easy to utilize. And okay, the engine says that this is all okay, but in my opinion, practically this isn't so easy to play with black. And of course, you know, if we were to play g takes f6, then we may as well play g takes f6 against this line, as this basically is going to transpose this very soon. White will play e3 and black will probably play c5, and we have that exact same position. So instead, what do I recommend in this position? Well, I recommend playing this move c6, which is quite subtle. And I believe this is like, actually I checked in the database earlier, this is the 8th most common move in this position. So it's not that likely that your opponents, if they do face this, are going to know how to react so well to this, and honestly, I don't think white can get an advantage against this. And basically, our idea is to just wait a little bit and see what white's going to do. If they play a move like bishop d3, knight f3, any move like that, we're going to play bishop g4, and if they take here, we're going to play e takes f6, and now, if they go for the setup of c4, we're going to take, and now bishop d6, and we essentially have the setup that we were aiming for in the other line here with e takes f6. But say they go bishop d3, as I was saying, we're going to play bishop g4, and we're simply attacking the queen, so they need to do something. If they play f3, we can just retreat, and we can play it like this with knight bd7, and we have this very harmonious setup where we manage to get our light squared bishop outside the pawn chain. And now, instead of playing something like e6, which is arguably a bit more passive, we can play very actively in the center with e5, and black is already equal, if not maybe even slightly better. And the same thing goes for if white plays knight f3 here after bishop g4. We can play the same in the same manner with knight bd7. They might play like knight bd2, and we just play e5, and black definitely already is more than fine here. Alright, so with all this theory in mind, now let's look at two games I've played, which were both Butz games over the last year or so, and from these games we'll be able to see some of the typical middle game ideas which can be implemented from these positions. Alright, so the first game we're going to be looking at here started with bishop takes f6, and we got this position, and my opponent played the very kind of typical setup where white goes to c4. And briefly I'd just like to talk about g3 as well, as we're going to kind of see this sort of typical idea later on in the game, what happens when white plays g3. And basically, I don't recommend castling immediately, and the reason is strangely enough, this pawn on g3 can be seen as a hook for our h pawn. And we're not going to play h5 immediately, there's some timing to this and some finesse. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to just kind of play moves like c6, which are moves that we'd play anyway, but we want to play these sort of like natural developing moves before castling. And say white plays bishop g2, we're going to play stuff like bishop e6 maybe, f5 will also work, knight g2, bishop e6, and now say that white castles, this all of a sudden is a really big opportunity for us because now we can play h5. And now if white tries to play h4 to stop us from playing h4 ourselves, we can go all out and just play g5, just going the mad attack on the king side, and there's nothing white can really do about this. And this whole castle move actually is a mistake on itself. Like, white just simply played knight d2. Now if we play like something like h5, h4, g5, white could probably play something like knight f3, and all of a sudden it's not so easy as they're consolidating on the king side. But a lot of people will just fall into this and they'll be kind of oblivious to this whole h5 plan, which is not that common. And instead after g5 we're going to get a sort of position like this where we'll play h4, and this sort of thing is extremely difficult for white to defend, and quite frankly even against like a grandmaster I would be pretty confident I could win this. So anyways, back to the game here. My opponent played c4, I took here, then we get this sort of structure which we were talking about earlier where I play f5, and yeah, here my opponent played g3, and this is a very strange move because, well, it actually surprised me because I was checking the Lichess database when preparing this video, and g3 was actually the second most played move here in database. And it's just a terrible move really, it makes no sense because if you're going to play g3 it should be for the purpose of your bishop being there and being on this diagonal. But here my opponent just kind of played what we'd call like an aesthetic move. It kind of looks good, you know, you trade off your dark squared bishop, then you put your pawns on dark squares, right? But the problem is it more or less just creates this weakness that I can later latch onto after queen e7, rook fc1. Again, he's trying to play in the queen side, but it's a bit slow. He's not really getting to the point here. And I can quickly play h5, and it's all of a sudden just getting pretty unpleasant for white really. At this point, I think the engine's already saying like -2, which is often considered this decisive advantage for black. So my opponent tried playing bishop d3, but this is too superficial. It just attacks the pawn one tempo. I just played g6, back it up, king g7. Very natural move, preparing rook h8 and then h4. So my opponent finally plays b4, which is kind of part of the minority attack plan I was talking about earlier, preparing to play b5 and on -1 here. In hindsight, I probably should have just ignored this threat and just continued my own play here with h4. And sure, like white can be like, oh, I create some small weakness here on c6, but it really doesn't matter because I'm going to take here. I can play like bishop b7 and open this diagonal up for the bishop here, which is really dangerous. And it's really just difficult to believe in this for white. But instead, okay, I played it passively. I was a bit weaker at the time this game, so I'll forgive myself. But in general, I was just kind of preparing the attack by activating my bishop to this diagonal. And now my opponent played knight f4. And this is a very reasonably common thing you'll see, but whenever white plays a move like this, I like to snap it off because very often, well, somehow they're going to have to double their own pawns, which are going to create some of their own weaknesses. And unlike our doubled pawns, I don't believe these doubled pawns are as good for white. And my opponent played g takes f4, which it radically weakens the king side, but the alternative of e takes f4 also isn't that great because then d6 becomes really weak. So after g takes f4, I played knight g4, and I went really in for the attack here with, okay, I played b6 first, but then I played queen h4, and already after h3 I could have delivered a killer blow with bishop b3, forking the queen and knight here, and then if white takes, I can play check and checkmate. But unfortunately I didn't see that, and I meddled around a bit, and we kind of got some weird stuff here where I played g5. We were probably in heavy time trouble by this point. It was a blitz game, so it's probably not worth like hyper-analyzing this too much, but okay, he can't take because this is mate, but I'm not too sure why he didn't take like this, because if I take back like this now, I'm not exactly sure what I'm going to do here. But okay, in the game he played bishop g2, and I just kind of killed him from here because I played g takes f4, and he thought he could take here and win a piece, but I surprised him by playing f3 check, and it basically leads to forced checkmate from here because if he takes with the king, it's the mate, and if he goes back with the king here, I can deliver some checks and eventually mate. Alright, so now we're going to finish up with a game in the other line here, where white plays e3 and they delay taking on f6, or they just don't take on f6 at all. And here I played c6, move I recommended, bishop d3, bishop g4, knight f3, knight b7, and I got this very harmonious development here where I played e5, and at this point, again as I was saying earlier, I was definitely more than equal here and I was very happy. He already played this very passive move, bishop e2, and I mean, it's difficult to blame him because taking like this, it's not exactly that appealing. If you played bishop e2 like this, maybe I'd take with the bishop, play bishop d6 here, and I think black is nothing to complain about. But instead he played this passive move, bishop e2, and I played bishop d6 because I didn't exactly want to play e4 right now because then it would allow the knight into e5 where it looks a little bit annoying. So I decided, okay, first I'm going to develop my bishop, and he played c4. Now I'll play e4 because now knight e5 simply loses the pawn. So he retreated back and now I took, and we got this sort of French-like position, except it feels like I'm playing with white since I have the space advantage here. And by this point you can already really see that the opening has been a success for black, and we don't really need to analyze this much deeper, I'd say, but I'll just go over the rest of the game for some instructive purposes, I guess, although it wasn't really that instructive. I'm being honest, he played knight c3, queen b8, I attacked the pawn, and he tried playing h3, and now I play h6, because the idea was sort of if he played bishop h4, now I can think, I was sort of thinking I could play g5 and maybe win a pawn here, although this might have been a tad ambitious, because he might have had like takes, and rook f5, and this, and attacking this. Probably had more than enough compensation here, but that was my idea, and so he just believed me and he took, and we got this sort of position where I just felt like I had a pretty comfortable space advantage. Knight b5 might sort of be an idea here, so I just played a6 to stop that, and yeah, here I played queen a7, which is a little bit mysterious, kind of covering this square and this, but it's not too bad, and essentially this position, it's either equal or black is slightly better since I have this dark sword bishop, which is just unopposed. And yeah, he played b4, b6, I covered this weak square. And yeah, I felt pretty comfortable, but at the same time, white's position is not disastrous. And yeah, what happened was kind of weird, but again, it was a blitz game, so he played queen d1, a5, and for some reason here he didn't play b5, kind of shutting my play down here. And if you played this, I think black would probably be slightly better, but at the same time it's difficult to really do much because I have to always keep an eye on this weak b6 pawn, and it's not so easy to take advantage of some of white's weaknesses like b5 pawn and this a3 pawn. But instead he played queen b3, and this is why this game is not so instructive, because I could just simply take here and then play a takes b4, and he simply blundered that you can't take back because now this knight's hanging. So he played knight b2, but then I took this pawn, and now the knight has to retreat, so this really passes square d1, but like by this point you can already tell that I'm up 2 pawns. I have this passed pawn that is very close to promoting this. No real reason to go over much more here, although I'll just show the last moves. a2, rook a1, queen a5, a nice idea, simply attacking this knight here. He played knight c3. It looks like he's about to win this pawn, but I hit him with this move rook c8, very nice, with the idea that if he's going to take back the pawn with the rook or the queen, then I take on c3, and if he takes the knight, then I can take on d2 with the queen. So he was just dead lost here, and the game didn't go on much longer. Alright, thank you for sticking around till the end. Hopefully you learned something useful and that you can use these variations in your next game against Trompowsky to score some nice wins, and leave any questions down below in the comments if you have any questions. Also like, subscribe, all that good stuff. Anyways, see you.